the EscapeGoat podcast, a podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Fagiani, and several different guests. Hello, welcome to episode 64 of the EscapeGoat podcast, and I'm delighted to welcome back Nannina. How are you, Nannina?
I'm doing all right.
Good, fantastic. How's your? I mean, we're recording this in sort of coming up for mid-April. How's your month been so far? What have you been up to?
What have I been up to? Mostly just working at the coffee shop, and my sister is visiting from Thailand, so.
Oh, lovely.
That's really nice to have her around, since she only does that like once a year.
And other than that, you've just been enjoying the paradise that is being a woman in America in 2024, you know.
The paradise, yes.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
I imagine we'll check in throughout this year on how that's going in various ways.
Being in Massachusetts tends to soften the various buffets.
Yeah, that would shelter you from the storm somewhat, I suppose, when it comes to some of it. It's going to be a very dramatic year, I think, on this side of the pond as well, in a lot of respects. Nannina, I was saying that you've not been on the show, well, you've been on the show quite a few times now, which I linked in the show notes, but you have not been on the show in over a year, when we recorded our episode in early 2023 about Holiday and the Hitch-Hiker proxy, which I had a fantastic time with, and got to see a new movie out of it as well, in the shape of Holiday, which was wonderful. I'll direct people back to that episode as well. But I kind of felt like we'd recorded more recently than that because, well, partly because I've listened to you doing other podcasts, but also because I've actually seen you in that time. Either, I can't remember if it's in the same time zone, but either twice or once within that period, both in London. And that was a tremendous treat. And, you know, I should say, you know, people who've listened to this before probably know that I'm in London in the UK, and Nannina just mentioned she's in Massachusetts in the States. So we don't see each other that often face to face, it's fair to say.
I think that other than the June visit, so both visits have been in this interval where you have not invited me on the podcast.
Sure.
But I think before that we hadn't seen each other since probably 2009.
I think I don't know about that. I think it was because I think I'd seen you again probably in London like pre-pandemic. I think maybe like 2018 or something. Oh yeah,
that. No, but that was I think 2011.
That's terrifying.
Yeah. We met up for coffee, I think, in 2011.
Yeah, I was trying to remember. Anyway, this is babbling away. This is very interesting to listen to. We don't see each other very much face to face, and luckily, you know, podcasting has allowed us to keep in touch a bit more and, you know, sort of stay in touch with what we're up to. But anyway, you came to London. You visited, saw you twice with some other old uni friends, and last time you visited, the second of those two times, we actually got to do something cool together. We got to go to the BFI. The South Bank BFI, British Film Institute cinema on the South Bank of the Thames in London, which, you know, has several cinema auditoriums and also has, you know, a cool shop and, like, you know, for people who know, you know, curates a lot of film festivals and things like that. And I think it was your first visit there, wasn't it?
Yes, or at least to see something there.
Yeah, which was really fun. And we went to see a film called Nana. Even though I've seen it, I don't know if I've still got that right.
I think Nana is how they would say it in it.
Nana is how they said it. I was trying to think back to the dialogue, and, you know, was that right? And this is part of their Dorothy Arzner season, wasn't it? And you were very, very, very keen to go and see at least something in that season, and that was the one you had both not seen and could manage to get to, wasn't it?
Yeah, I was very excited to see that Dorothy Arzner season had been programmed, and it's like I am in the same. Well, not technically country because I was up in Scotland, but I came down for it. Yeah,
you had a quick jaunt for it. Yeah, it was good. I mean, for those podcast listeners here who aren't rabid Arzner heads, do you want to sort of explain, well, briefly who Dorothy Arzner was? And I will ask you to be brief because obviously we'll be talking about loads more stuff in this podcast.
The best person ever.
Yeah, pretty respected female film director. It's fair to say, isn't it?
Yeah, she was the only woman director who was able to work within the studio system during the sort of classic Hollywood time period. So there were other women working outside of the studios, but Dorothy Arzner had a contract, first with Paramount, and then later worked freelance within the studio system for Columbia, RKO, and other studios. And so she is still the American woman director who has directed the most studio films. And this is a little bit sad since she directed her last film in 1943. So
yeah. So a real titan of the sort of, silent era and then the early sound era, it's fair to say, isn't it?
Yes, and just brought the medium of film forward technically. She developed the first boom mic, and also artistically. She's just a really amazing director.
Yeah, well, I was absolutely thrilled to be able to accompany you to that screening, and I really enjoyed watching Nana as well, and I kind of... Although I was looking forward to spending time with you, and I knew it would be of historical interest, an aesthetic interest, I kind of wasn't expecting to like it as much as I did, because it had kind of been... I think you tried to dampen my expectations a bit by saying it's not one of Arzner's best thought of movies, and it's kind of... It's not one of her like burning classics, basically, in a lot of respects. And I didn't read much about it before going in, but I'd seen that confirmed in my own reading as well. And then I actually had a really good time with it. I thought it was pretty lively. We kind of talked about it in the night, didn't we? It's not perfect, but it was pretty well done and amusing, and some really cool camera work in it and stuff. Was that kind of your take on it?
I was very impressed because I was going in with very low expectations. It's generally considered Dorothy Arzner's worst film, and so I didn't want to go in and be disappointed, and I really enjoyed it. I do feel like the actors are in about 5 different movies, but they're all very committed to the movies that they're in, and I thought it was a fascinating adaptation of the source material and much more sympathetic than the source material is and has been adapted in other ways.
Yeah, because it's based on the Zola novel, isn't it? I found out either shortly before or after we watched it. And there's been a few versions of it, or kind of quasi-adaptations of it. But yeah, I wasn't really familiar with that. And both the story and the plot's kind of about for people who don't know, is about this lady who sort of rises through French society at the turn of the century and turn of the last century, and uses... well, sort of navigates society in a complicated way to do with her love affairs and to do with show business. And
well, she starts at the movie as a sex worker, basically. And
yeah, that was a very British way I was trying to talk around to that. Yeah.
And moves into society through the theater. The various men that try to have affairs with her and control over her career and her life, and how she reacts to that, and how she allows herself to be exploited, and the line she draws in not being exploited, and what power is given to her as an attractive woman, and what powers are not given to her as an attractive woman in society. And I think Dorothy Arzner is very sensitive to all of these dynamics in ways that a lot of films dealing with prostitution in the 1930s weren't as able to be.
Yeah, and this is pre-code, of course, isn't it? We didn't even mention just pre-code. So
very pre-code, though.
Yeah, it is very pre-code, and I think her sort of sex worker best mates characters in it are amongst the most amusing parts of it, and they get quite a lot of risque lines and a lot of dialogue that seems quite modern compared to other bits in the film, and some movies it was surrounded with. I think they sort of struck a chord, I thought.
Yeah. They're fun characters. Definitely, as I said, in a different movie from some of the other characters, but one wants to be part of that movie, definitely. And
yeah, the Timon and Pumbaa of her story.
And one thing Dorothy Arzner always excelled at was showing female friendships, and the very natural dynamics of the way women interact when they are alone and not in the company of men. And that's part of what makes her films so delightful, to get to see sort of classic Hollywood style but really intimately rendered female characters.
Yeah.
It's a delight.
Well, thank you for inviting me to go see that with you, and for educating me in a fun way. And that's kind of a nice preamble into the kind of main topic of this conversation tonight, or sort of the two main topics, because we're discussing a movie double bill. And I wanted to sort of preface this by saying that this is probably the first podcast I've recorded as an apology, or if you want to look at it, more generously to me, I suppose, as a thank you, essentially, as a heartfelt thank you for bearing with me, because you've been on this podcast now at least 5 times, I think probably more, maybe 5-6 times, and something like that, and you've I will link to those before, and you've been extremely generous in talking to me about loads of movies that, to varying degrees, I've suggested. I mean, that's not fully true. You did suggest Holiday. So there's we've had a bit of that in, and obviously they've often been films that we mutually agree are good, or we want to talk about, and everything like that. But you have been very indulgent of me, which is I appreciate, and I particularly appreciate the fact that. We'll talk more about this, but as I mentioned on some of the previous episodes, and as you've mentioned as well, you do know a lot about particularly female-directed cinema from various periods of history, and you're very knowledgeable about that, and you're very entertaining about that on Twitter and other forums, and on this whole thing so far, we haven't discussed any female-directed movies, or at least, we're not in detail.
They've all been directed by men.
Yeah, which is, we're starting to seem increasingly insulting, really. I think maybe I was starting to enjoy it as sort of a running joke in its own right, but I definitely owed you, and I think it's an interesting area to talk about as well, and you're very interesting about it. So yeah, basically for this episode, I said to Nannina, go nuts, give me a film double bill. I suggested, and that was at least the format of it. But choose 2 female directed movies of any sort that you like and think the audience would be interested in, and we'll go with it, and I'll be interested in whether I've seen them or not. And as it turns out, you chose 2 films that I hadn't seen, one of which I knew more about than the other, but they were both new watches to me. So tonight we're discussing The Hitch-Hiker, directed by Ida Lupino, from 53. Is that
53?
Right?
Yeah.
53. And Point Break, directed by Kathryn Bigelow, from 1991. I imagine more of our audience will be familiar with that one. I'd read more about that one, heard more about it in pop culture, had not seen it though. First time viewing of both of them for me. So I think they make an interesting double bill. There's certainly things we can tag them together in. But different directors, different eras. We'll talk about them. Let's start with The Hitch-Hiker.
In a box by a cop, me nut job, have a cup of tea, I'm the hitcher. Let me put you in the picture, creeping in your room in the dead of night with me solo polo vision. That's right. I'm a cop, me geezer, watch me bleed you. I knew the Ripper when he was just a nipper. I taught him how to slice, I cut him up a tree. Burn your banana, burn your banana, burn your banana, 40 shillings for your melon.
Oh yeah, we're the Piper twins. With Jim and Jackie Piper, we cut through the night like a windscreen, wiping you away like raindrops. Don't mess with the boys.
Shut your noise, coming in strong like a freak show nightmare. Dancing skeletons, white, blue and yellow ones, moving through the shadows with the speed of a cat. And if you cross us, we'll catch ya. I bear juju, I use voodoo if I choose to. I harness the forces of evil to abuse you with power. Apollo, an evil magnet, we're sucking up your soul. You ain't gonna like that.
So this is, I think, the first Ida Lupino directed movie I've ever seen, and I had a really good time reading up about her and watching the movie. I read up a bit about her before it, then watched the movie, and then read a bit more about her. Again, in the same vein as Dorothy Arzner, maybe we could probably assume that some of our listeners, not to be patronising, but some of our listeners will know a bit less about Ida Lupino than Kathryn Bigelow. Although I think she might be one of the best named people in Hollywood history. It's a great name, and I think I'd heard of her shortly after becoming a film nerd in my sort of adolescence. I think I'd heard the name at least, as a Hollywood great of some repute. Would you like to sort of tell people a little bit about Ida Lupino?
Well, she is best known as an actress, actually, and she comes from a British acting dynasty. The Lupinos go back, I mean, they made claims back to like the 17th century of having Lupinos in show business. So she didn't have a lot of choice in what career she was going to pursue, and ended up on the stage from a very young age. Started making movies when she was about 13 or 14, came to Hollywood as a 15-year-old. Feeling she was being put up for playing Alice in Alice in Wonderland, and she already felt that she was far too sophisticated to play Alice in Wonderland. But she got known in the 40s for sort of playing these hard-boiled women, sometimes femme fatales, sometimes just women that have to have a hard scrabble existence and have to work hard to stay on top of things. One film that she really is fantastic in is Roadhouse, where she plays a nightclub singer, and it's another noir film that she's in. She was probably her best known film is High Sierra with Humphrey Bogart, where she's more in the femme fatale line. And she was under contract to Warner Brothers, which is kind of a notorious studio in terms of stars being a little bit disappointed in how they were treated while being under contract and getting put on probation. And she got put on probation a lot because she didn't want to do the material that they were requiring her to do. And whenever she would go and observe the other films getting made, and absorbed a lot of filmmaking that way. And her aunt actually was a silent film director in Britain and producer. So it was always in her head that directing is a possibility for a woman. So in about 1948, 1949, she got together both professionally and personally with producer Collier Young, writer-producer, and they started a production company and they got married. And their first film was a film called Not Wanted, about an unwed mother. It is an incredibly powerful, beautiful film. And originally, Elmer Clifton was hired to direct it, but he had a heart attack during pre-production and was not well enough to be the main force on set. So Ida Lupino stepped up and into the directing chair, which was not a disappointment for her. Before Not Wanted had been in production, her birthday present was a directing chair with her name on it. So this was something that she very much wanted, but she was not a member of the Guild. And so though she has a producer credit on Not Wanted, she is not the official director on it. Elmer Clifton, his name is on it as the director. But from the first day of shooting, she was basically at least co-directing, if not fully directing, Not Wanted. And she and Collier Young co-produced together 5 films under the production company, The Filmmakers, along with another writer, Melvin Ward. And it was a rocky relationship between all 3 of them. And Collier Young was in charge of a lot of the financial side of things, and he was not actually that savvy with that aspect of things, and made some pretty stupid moves in terms of how the company would run, which is why it did not last longer than those 5 films between 1949 and 1953. By 1953, though they were still an independent production company, they were under contract to Howard Hughes and at RKO. And that is how The Hitch-Hiker was produced and released. So I hope that gives a little background.
No, that's a great overview, and it sort of contextualises the point in her career that we'll be discussing in more detail with The Hitchhiker. I mean, from my reading, I read that, afterwards, although she didn't stay directing films for that long in the scheme of things after that, and was decreasingly in them, although not never in them after that, she did become a very prolific TV director, and was in quite a bit of TV as well. But she just worked. If you go on Wikipedia and read up what her TV credits were, in the, I guess, mostly the 60s and the 70s, most prolifically. It's just everything. It's just a list of everything. Every American TV show you've heard of from that period and that ran for many seasons and everything, she dabbled in everything. I mean, I was perhaps predictably most thrilled to learn that she played a Batman villain in the 60s Batman serial. I think she's like, is it like Dr. Cassandra or something? She's like one of the ones they made up for the show, I think, unless it's a comics deep cut I'm not aware of. But I must rewatch that episode. The 60s Batman's still kind of absurdly difficult to watch in Britain. I don't know if it's easier in the States, but something about the rights issues and stuff is just a bit of a nightmare. But I'll track it down.
I have faith.
Oh, yeah, I hope so. But the other thing I was really impressed is, as an old Twilight Zone fan, she holds the plaudit of being the only female director of a Twilight Zone episode, which I think is called Masks. And she's in another episode, a different episode of The Twilight Zone, which is, I forget the name of it now, but it's the one that's a bit like a slightly more surreal Sunset Boulevard, essentially, with a relatively aging film star who is obsessed with her movie heyday and actually, spoilers for The Twilight Zone, apparently it's quite a famous Twilight Zone ending. I wasn't particularly familiar with this one, but she sort of almost like is transported magically back into her film heyday, through special effects and stuff. And I don't know if I ever watched that one. I'm going to look it up. I remember Masks a bit, the one that she directed, and I remember that being quite cool visually, although I had no idea she directed it at the time. So I'm going to rewatch that. So, I mean, for learning that alone, it was worth like falling down a bit of a Lupino rabbit hole, because that's just amazing.
Yeah, even when her work as an independent producer, director ended, she pursued directing on television, and she did have one last feature film directing credit in 66, I believe, of The Trouble with Angels, starring Hayley Mills and Rosalind Russell. And one funny little thing is that Dorothy Arzner watched Not Wanted. Ida Lupino invited her to a screening, and at the end of it, Dorothy Arzner said, "Mark my word, she'll be directing Rosalind Russell someday." And she did. So Rosalind Russell was directed both by Dorothy Arzner and by Ida Lupino.
That's a very perfect nexus of you there. That's a sort of Venn diagram overlap that I think almost perfectly illustrates you. I was struck. It's funny, isn't it, when you're reading about, as you do much more than me, obviously, like when you're reading about trailblazing female artists particularly from different eras, and let's face it, the mid 20th century is a completely different era now in a lot of respects. It's weird, isn't it, when you get the thing with these like in some ways absolutely jaw-droppingly progressive individuals and people who achieved stuff against the barriers and biases put up against their gender, when they say something that kind of sounds like something you probably wouldn't hear, a quote-unquote modern woman say, because obviously they're people of their time and everything. I was quite struck. It's not like an offensive thing or anything, but I was struck when she was talking about her own work, when Lupino was talking about her work. She was talking about working on set with men and with male camera operators and stuff like that, and she was sort of, I can't remember the exact quote, but she was basically talking about kind of playing dumb a bit to get kind of the best out of them. I think basically saying that, if she went up to them and pretended to know less than she did, they'd basically behave better. They'd enjoy showing her how to do it, and they'd sort of work better on set. And, than if she kind of, I guess, lorded over them a bit, or kind of, played, I guess, the knowledgeable / quote unquote bossy woman, I suppose, as a director. And I thought that was really interesting because, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that wouldn't probably work with a lot of men nowadays, but just the fact that she talked about it as this sort of canny operator in Hollywood of her time, and it wasn't all just, running in there and owning the place loudly, it was to do with kind of being quite a clever operator and kind of realising what the sort of, maybe not that pretty, but sort of pragmatic realities of male behaviour on set are and how to navigate them,
She was an incredibly pragmatic woman, and though she could be in her personal life quite volatile, she was also very professional when on set and was able to tamp down her personal feelings on things in order to get what she wanted and to not be offended, to allow her charisma as a film star to influence people and to allow people maybe to misjudge her a little bit in order to get in the end what she wanted. So yes, the way that she describes working on set saying, Mother has this problem. It might sound a little kooky, but you boys think that you can work it out for her. And her directing chair eventually did say Mother on it. And what I find most fascinating is the way that she worked with the censors, which was always, she was very complimentary of the censors. And a big part of that was that she knew that every film that she made was on the line of what the production code allowed. And by appearing to be accommodating to the censors, she got away with things that no one else did. And so with Not Wanted, not only was it a sympathetic story about an unwed mother, she managed to have a scene that showed a birth on screen in a movie that she was not allowed to use the word pregnancy in because of the censors. But she has this amazing scene that is the POV of the unwed mother, the main character played by Sally Forrester, going in and out of consciousness as she's having a cesarean performed on her. And so in 1949, Ida Lupino literally put audiences inside the skin of an unwed mother giving birth, which, if she hadn't been able to play ball and to complement the egos of the Breen office, the production code people, she would not have been able to do that. And actually, The Hitch-Hiker was another film that she really had to do a very delicate dance with the censors in order to get it done, because you were not allowed to make a film about a current criminal that might be perceived as celebrating criminality. And The Hitchhiker is very closely tied to a murder spree performed by Billy Cook, who was arrested in January of 1951. Ida Lupino optioned the story in February of 1951. The film was filmed in 52 and released in 53. So this was an incredibly recent use of torn from the headlines crime and murder.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, so much to talk about there. I mean, firstly, I need to see that movie because, you talk about that sort of pregnancy cesarean sequence. I mean, that looks ahead to, everything from sort of Rosemary's Baby to kind of David Cronenberg movies and stuff. It sounds like, it sounds extraordinary. And the censorship thing, it's funny, we were talking about Arzner, weren't we, doing most of her work, pre-code and everything, and obviously that's not the case with Lupino. She's right in the middle of one of the most stringent censorship, periods of Hollywood history, as you say. And I think The Hitchhiker is really interesting in terms of that because, you were talking about her, dancing on the edge of things that she's allowed to get away with in movies and including movies. I was struck, I think we've talked about this before on the podcast, but, the famous thing about Psycho, or semi-famous thing about Psycho in 1960 being that, was it like the first time in American cinema that a toilet had been shown flushing, and that was daring. And I was thinking, we'll get into this properly, but watching The Hitchhiker, I was thinking about Psycho a bit, which comes out 7 years after this. And I think that's partly because of the aesthetics of the movie, and partly of The Hitchhiker, that is, and partly because I was placing it in what was allowed and what wasn't, and what The Hitchhiker might be pointing forward to. And I want to talk to you a bit more about that in terms of the genre and stuff. But yeah, so The Hitchhiker, I had heard of this as an Ida Lupino directed movie, and I know it's one of her most, I guess, seen and remembered, and I think it's in the public domain, isn't it? At least in
it
parts.
is, yeah.
Yeah.
Though Ken Lorber has done, the Library of Congress did a beautiful restoration, and Ken Lorber has done a beautiful Blu-ray release that is better quality than most of the public domain prints.
Yeah, well, let me absolutely horrify you, because the way I watched this movie was, because you hinted at that as well, that I might find a public domain copy, but it might not be very good quality, and I could find a higher quality copy elsewhere and stuff like that. And being the unheedy idiot that I am, what I did is I went with the easy option, which was the Amazon Prime available option on this side of the pond, and I watched it, and it was this, like, I don't know if this is the one you were referring to, but it was, in this case, it was like a kind of dreadfully colorized version.
Oh no!
Yeah. So what? But what I actually did is I actually genuinely watched about 10 minutes of it. It was this kind of thing where I was, because it really was bad as well. Like it was like I've seen a bit worse, but you know, it was really kind of splodgy and all over the place and kind of a bit hallucinogenic in its own right. I was sort of digging it on its own level, but then I was like, I have to watch this movie. So I actually did the thing of like, I didn't find another copy. I literally just turned the color down on my TV set. I don't think I've ever actually used that setting before, but I just found it and just made it completely black and white, which is probably absolute heresy, but at least it was closer to, you know, to something watchable, because I would have been too distracted by the effect if I hadn't done that, you know. So I then watched it in black and white, which I think is more what it's meant to look like. I probably wasn't getting the full effect. So yeah, I can see Nannina's just lost quite a lot of respect for me in quite a vertiginous way. Yeah. That's like saying I like went to the Ritz and ordered like a lobster dinner, isn't it? And then like, you know, I put some McDonald's fries on it, or you know, it's kind of it's up there. Anyway, apologies for that as well. I owe you another podcast, but I wanted you to sort of explain to people again who haven't heard of it at all, because I didn't know much about it, basically what The Hitch-Hiker is, what kind of movie it is.
It is a film noir, but it's in the sort of road noir category where, as the title implies, it involves a hitchhiker who is, in the world of the movie, is named Emmett Myers. He's based on the criminal Billy Cook, as I mentioned, and the movie starts with some great point of view shots during the opening credits that give a little bit of backstory of his killing spree, where you see just the legs of this man and his shadow against the road, and he's has his thumb out and a car pulls over with a couple in it and he gets in, and for the beginning of the film you do not see Emmett Myers' face at all. You just see little snippets, his feet mostly, and the results of his crimes. So you see him get out of the car and shoot twice, and then the woman's handbag falls out and he takes the money from that and wanders on, and then gets picked up by another person. And so this introduction creates this sense of mounting dread and this invasion into not necessarily a domestic sphere, but a sphere that people consider that they have some control over.
That's it's interesting you talk about it as noir, and we'll get back to that as well. But and you talk about the sort of sphere, the sort of sacred sphere, in a sense, the quasi domestic sphere of a car and a car in 50s America, that kind of thing. Because I was thinking, of the sort of subgenre, I guess, of horror that's sort of the home invasion movie, where homes are threatened and people are threatened in where they live. And this does have, I will talk more about this in a time. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but it echoes ahead to future horror works for me. But that is one way, isn't it? It does feel like this is in a sense quite, as you say, ripped from the headlines, quite sort of sleazy horror in a sense, or like proto horror, but it's also it is really hitting 1953 Americans where it hurts. It's making them feel unsafe in sort of such a totemic symbol of American freedom. And
a lot of what Ida Lupino wanted to do was to bring a sort of neo-realist quality to American cinema. She was very interested when she met Roberto Rossellini, and though her films aren't necessarily neo-realist, this ripped from the headlines quality and every person type characters who then get put into extraordinary situations, combined with very low budgets, gives her films this interesting quality of being somewhere between like a B picture and an A picture. And there's a lot going on in them, but there is also this low budget grunge to them as well, and earthiness.
Definitely, yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose stepping sideways, if I'm getting my dates right, or at least vaguely right, but we talked about Psycho already, and Psycho shares some aesthetics with Alfred Hitchcock Presents and with TV, which is partly to do with its production and everything. I was thinking that this would this is like, in some ways, like an extended episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. I could see it sort of fitting into that, and it's interesting that Lupino goes on to be such a prolific and successful TV director, because I think although there are definitely, more traditional, I guess, cinematic aspects of this, and the desert landscape of everything like that, but whenever you're in the car, that is such a perfect confined set, isn't it?
Very much so. It's very much a claustrophobic, and a lot in Hitchcock's vein. One funny thing is that she released a film called Hard, Fast, and Beautiful about a tennis star the same year that Hitchcock released Strangers on a Train. And I think Hard, Fast, and Beautiful has noir elements to it. It's not a noir film, but there are definitely some noir elements to it. And one thing that stood out to me watching Hard, Fast, and Beautiful, and why I looked it up in relation to Strangers on a Train, is that there's a line in it, a girl's best friend is her mother. And I'm like, wait, which one came first? And they were in production at the same time. And I was recently reading the Ida Lupino biography, and the missing link that I hadn't found initially was that Ida Lupino at the time was dating Robert Walker.
Wow.
And so I don't know how much she was influenced by knowing Hitchcock was doing Strangers on a Train. Some of the tennis scenes are kind of similar, or how much it was just sort of independent alignment between the two.
Yeah, that's an interesting, however linked you could work those out to be, that's such an interesting dance of talents around each other, isn't it? In this, in such a weird sort of transitional decade in some ways, the 50s, in terms of what's being shown and what's being focused on.
Now this is how we get out after this. First give me the keys. Now we all get out the same side, this one. I get out first, then you. Stand away from the car, and then you. Let's go.
Drop your jackets around your elbows. Turn around. We're gonna open the trunk. Move. Pull your jackets up. You. Open the trunk. Both of you, keep your hands on the lid. Throw me the keys. I'll get the blankets. You'd never make it. Get the groceries, you. Whose gun is that?
Mine.
You like to shoot?
Yeah. So do I. So I'm warning you, don't try anything smart with me. Move.
Because we could talk about, let's go full Hitchcock and talk about some of the Freudian implications in this, as we go along. But actually, I wanted to maybe get into that sort of gender stuff a bit, actually. I wanted to talk to you about one of the things that I found most striking in this, and I'm not sure how sort of deliberate it was, or maybe how shaped by the sort of, real life stories that it's at least somewhat based on. But one thing that struck me watching this was the moment I got into the feel of the movie and the plot of the movie, and I sort of gathered that it would be mostly about these two male friends who, Roy and Gil, or Gilbert in the movie, who are being menaced. They're the primary targets of the movie. They're the victims of the movie, essentially, and they're the hostages of the movie for a large part of its runtime. I'm not saying I've never seen a film where two male friends are the product of a potential killer's ire and danger, and held at extended peril. I'm sure that I've seen at least TV episodes based on that, maybe movies, but I was quite struck to see maybe particularly a 50s American movie where they are men in distress. But they are the they're the final, the phrase, the final girls. They're the sort of final boys of this movie, and are at gunpoint, literally or figurative, for the run of it. As someone who's watched decades and decades of horror movies where, from Psycho onwards, where women are more often menaced by men with guns or men with knives or both, and there's this whole subgenre of the slasher movie. This is, I wouldn't be quite so bold as to call this a proto-slasher, but I think there are ways in which it's hinting ahead, maybe not so explicitly as things like Psycho. But I wondered if you had thoughts about that, because this male friendship, which you're introduced to quite succinctly near the beginning of the movie, and then is threatened, and the sort of care that the men show for each other throughout it. Interesting, isn't it? I guess I'll just leave it there.
I mean, I think that The Hitchhiker is a fascinating look at post-war male friendship and masculinity in general. And I mean, part of the choices of the two films that I made was that these are some of the more accessible films directed by women, because they do focus on men. And in The Hitchhiker, they're literally, if you want to be very generous, are two female characters. One you never see, she's murdered in the opening credits, and the other is a little girl. And otherwise, it's an entirely masculine world. And all of Ida Lupino's other films working up to The Hitchhiker were very much rooted in female experiences. The unwed mother in Not Wanted, the dancer who ends up with polio in Never Fear, the tennis star in Hard, Fast, and Beautiful, and the rape victim in Outrage. So The Hitchhiker was Ida Lupino pivoting and seeing if she could... She didn't want to be stereotyped as a director who exclusively worked within the problems of women, and so The Hitchhiker was a bit of an experiment to see what she could do in a much more male-driven story.
Oh, that was conscious then, was it?
Yes.
Yeah.
There was another film that they could do about a high school girl who's kind of neglected by her parents and ends up attempting suicide and going with the wrong crowd and all of that. And she did end up being a producer on that one. The filmmakers produced that film, but she very much made a point of not directing it, and said that was her reason, that she had already dealt with female-centric stories with women in trouble, and she wanted to make a foray into something different.
It's weird, isn't it? It's almost paradoxical to celebrate a 50s movie directed by a pioneering female director for not having many women in it, but I think it's something that makes it age interestingly and gave it more of a unique appeal for me from a 2024 perspective, because as you say, there's the sort of unseen woman victim at the start, and there's the little girl. I was just thinking how easy it would be to put a pretty starlet in this movie narratively. You could obviously have her traveling, be the wife or girlfriend of one of the guys, and she could be menaced in a slightly different way by Emmett Myers, and I'm thinking aside to things like Night of the Hunter, but in a different way, Cape Fear, I guess, not only the contemporaneous Cape Fear, but also the remake, and the way in which female peril is eroticized in that kind of movie, or at least different, at least has a different charge to it. I really loved these characters. I loved I like the fact that they're just sort of they're kind of heroes. They do brave and bold things in it, but they're just so abjectly terrified for the bulk of it as well. Seeing sort of 50s male stars portray characters who are just really scared for most of the narrative was really interesting and kind of anti-macho in an interesting way. But I like that they are just kind of these two imperfect guys as well. They're having this, as the film opens, they're having this sort of slightly seedy, kind of disappointingly nostalgic holiday where they're both trying to sort of reconnect, but it's not clear how much they're really into it. They're sort of escaping their domestic lives and women to some degree back home, and they're trying to spend time together like when they were younger men. They're trying to visit some old haunts, but it's kind of not going well. I actually love the scene even before they pick up the hitchhiker where they go through that resort town that they both like fondly remember as like
Mexicali.
As being this like bacchanal sort of site, with like these like dancing girls that they remember in these like taverns and stuff. And they're about to sort of explore it, and one of the guys is just asleep, and then
it's interesting because he's the one. It's Gil. He suggests they go to Mexicali and not go on the fishing trip, and then once they get there, he's pretending to be asleep.
Right, interesting. Yeah, I didn't clock that he was pretending to be asleep. But yeah, it's just, again, it's kind of. I mean, you could say that, you know, if they got into too many, like, hijinks like that, you'd have to dance around the censors even more, you know. But, like, I like the way it portrays this kind of, like, quite realistic feeling early to middle-aged friendship between men where they both kind of want to act out and escape their sort of quotidian lifestyle, but they're kind of getting a bit old for it as well, you know, and they're kind of walking that line of bravado and nostalgia and, you know, genuine desire to escape, but kind of mixing it with their sort of growing humanity as they get a bit older and stuff, I suppose. You know, I just found it really engaging, you know, from the start, even before they're put under threat.
Yeah, the friendship angle of the film is really important to how they react in various situations, and Emmett Myers definitely makes fun of them for it and acts like that's a weakness of theirs, that if they were just acting out of their own interest, at least one of them would have been able to escape. But it's also a sort of power for them, not in a particularly preachy way, but they really are there for each other, and it's beautifully rendered friendship that is both just interesting to view on the screen and intrinsic to the plot and the story.
Yeah, Emmett almost becomes a sort of Randian villain in that sense, doesn't he? He almost becomes a sort of a villain with a philosophical argument that's, you know, born out of his own bitterness and estrangement from humanity, essentially, and I guess rough treatment at the hands of life, you know. But he does see it as a weakness, caring for other people, and there are, as you say, several points in this movie where one of the two guys could escape if they were ruthless and didn't care about the other one. You know, and that is a deliberate point being made, isn't it? You know, and as you say, like, mocked by the villain.
Yeah, and also, as I said, the story does hew very closely to the actual story of Billy Cook and the final people that he kidnapped, and while hitchhiking. Were two friends that were on a hunting trip in Mexico. So that aspect was both an interesting subversion of the expectations of the genre, having it be these two men and a friendship instead of having it be romantic connection where a woman could be threatened by Meyer. But it also provided opportunities. They took the true story and made it work cinematically, which is not always an easy thing to do. And it's interesting how close they hewed to the actual story, leaving out the murder of an entire family and their dog, which was the most brutal thing that Billy Cook did. But yeah.
Well, dog death is always hard to get past the censors, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that 3 kids under the age of 9 also, you know, frowned upon.
Yeah, but dogs though.
Yeah, but dogs.
That's the real final frontier. I was thinking, you know, because it's not, you know, I think this film's really, really good, and I think it's really worth watching for anyone who hasn't seen it. One thing I was thinking that made it feel a bit less modern, perhaps, and it's not in terms of sort of psychological complexity necessarily lacking, but in terms of presentation, I guess, and narrative choices. One thing I thought is, you know, because it's very clear that this dangerous man is around and is at large, and, you know, it's sort of seeded over the radio as well as, you know, you're seeing that preview shot at the beginning, is that they actually get the suspense of the actual picking up of the hitchhiker over with very, very quickly. You know, they do that neat thing where he's in darkness in the back seat, you know, so before the audience really twigs exactly how dangerous he is, you know, that, you know, it's hinted that he's pretty dangerous and they've not quite realised it yet, you know. But they do that quite quickly, and I think I was thinking of that partly because, you know, of horror things I've seen, you know, like I've recently rewatched Wolf Creek, for example, you know, the Australian, quite brutal, you know, horror movie from the noughties, but that does things, it has a very slow build-up where you get to know these friends like this movie, but then it has quite a gradual process where they get to know their eventual killer, essentially, but they kind of play around with how dangerous is this guy? Is he just a bit weird, or is he friendly, and is he their rescuer? And then it's a while before the scales are fully stripped away, and you realise how dangerous he is. And I think that the fact that they get into it so quickly in this, so abruptly, I can imagine a more extended, leisurely pace where maybe the guys have sort of, a bit more bonding with this guy before it becomes apparent how crazy he is and how dangerous he is. But I suppose he's not that sort of figure, isn't it? He's not a figure with charm, really. He is just dangerous,
Yeah, he really doesn't have much charm at all, and he has a bravado that mainly comes from the fact that he has this gun, and that he feels that is what is sort of totemic for giving him power, and it does give him power.
That alone makes it such an interesting American movie to analyse, doesn't it?
Yeah. But yeah, the film is incredibly tight. It's only 70 minutes long. And so there isn't actually that much time for development. It gets very quickly into it, and then we're in this claustrophobic ticking clock of when is he going to tire of them, basically, because he's playing with them. He could kill them at any moment. And that's sort of what Billy Cook would do. He would force people to drive him around aimlessly, sometimes for a week at a time before killing them.
Yeah, because there are some sort of fig leaves of where they could be of use to him at various points of the plot, aren't they? They could actually be a utility in terms of him escaping and reaching freedom, but it's not always that convincing. He is kind of... there are plot reasons to keep them around, but also he is just a psychopath.
Yeah, he is playing with them. It gives him a sense of power to have this control over them, and that is a lot to do with why he keeps them around, despite the fact that practically he doesn't need them. He could kill them and just take the car and get to Santa Rosalita by himself. But there is an element there that would defeat the point. He's not doing this because he needs to get somewhere. He's doing this because he wants control, and he has been denied control in his life.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's interesting, you talk about the possession and the sort of fetishization of the gun by Emmett as like this central part of it. I was very struck, actually, spoilers, I guess, for the Hitchhiker, but, in the climax of the movie, getting the gun off him is like not just an important plot point, not just a tool to defeating him, but it's almost like a symbolic, has a weight to it, doesn't it? They have to get the gun off him and then defeat him. Then he's lowered, and then he's pretty harmless, really. I mean, that he is shown to basically be a coward, and not even that physically strong, not unable to be overcome physically after that. And I was just thinking, actually, the scene again about guns where he basically forces them at gunpoint to do target practice, to have this kind of William Tell-esque kind of shooting gallery thing, and one friend is forced to shoot dangerously close to the other one and sort of prove that he can do that, essentially. It really reminded me of the bit in Skyfall where Craig's James Bond, is forced into a very similar situation by a villain who sort of knows that he's not the man he once was, that his hand shakes now, that he's been killing himself with drink, essentially, like James Bond always is, really, and that he's forced to shoot a shot glass off a woman's head and things like that. It's very, again, it's that sadism, isn't it? But it's the power of guns as well, and it's forcing these men to be the best possible shooters they can do while they're absolutely terrified. It's very complicated and very dark.
Yeah, that scene is a very interesting one. And unlike with a character like Bond, where we kind of know that he's going to succeed even if he's not what he once was, he's Bond, these are everyman guys. I mean, they have training, that they've been through World War II. They have trauma from that too, I'm sure. But you don't know for sure that Gil is going to be successful. And it's an incredibly tense scene.
Do you want to talk briefly, and I say this partly because I think it's going to work into, talking about this and similar is going to work into our discussion Point Break as well, as a lot of this will, actually. Do you want to talk briefly about the sort of use of Mexico in this film?
Well, yes, because one thing that the film does not age badly is in how it portrays the Mexican characters. And Ida Lupino was very adamant as a producer of wanting to integrate casts, and she had trouble with that in Not Wanted, where she had observed these homes for unwed mothers and realized that it was people of all different races living together, and she really wanted to portray that in Not Wanted, and one of the financiers said, absolutely not, you cannot do that. And she did slide into the background, a Chinese American extra in one of the scenes, but she talked quite a lot about wanting to do an entire movie set in the Mexican American community. So the fact that this story ends in Mexico with the Mexican police being the sort of heroic characters coming in was, I think, part of what attracted Ida Lupino to the story. Because that is what happened. It was the Mexican police that apprehended Billy Cook. And one thing that is quite modern about the film is that the Mexican characters, when they're in Mexico, they talk Spanish and there are no subtitles. You can tell via context clues what's going on. It's well shot so that it's very legible, but there is a respect given to these characters, though they are certainly supporting characters. The main narrative is the three men in the car. There isn't a heroic American detective that's going to rescue them. It's very much on the organization and detective work of the Mexican police, which...
You're right. It would be so easy to pad this out. That's another way it'd be easy to pad this out for another 15 minutes, wouldn't it? Have a detective subplot where he's, chasing them to catch up with them. He's essentially the Dr. Loomis to Michael Myers, basically. He's chasing them, whether from either side of the border. But you're right. The representation of Mexicans and their police force is very, laudatory, really, in this. I also like the use of Spanish in it. But you were saying the unsubtitled Spanish, and it's because it plays into the plot, because Emmett is ignorant. He doesn't speak Spanish. I'm not, I'm depressingly monolinguistic. I'm not judging anyone, but one of the things about him is that he obviously moves in these territories and doesn't learn the language. But he's aware, he's clever enough, he's wily enough to know that puts him at a disadvantage. And he has one of the guys talk Spanish to the locals to help them out in various ways, but he's also aware he could be saying things that he doesn't fully grasp and could be betraying him in Spanish, and that becomes another point of tension, and that's so well handled. And that's that the scene with that little girl, which is definitely appropriate for us to mention before we leave this movie, but that's attention to that, isn't it? What is he telling the little girl? Is Emmett aware? Is the audience fully aware? How scared is he? Is our hero that he won't? Will he betray him in Spanish when it's a possibility, But he's talking to this little girl, and Emmett challenges him on what we say to the little girl, and what he said to her is a paraphrase of Vaya Con Dios, isn't it? He's told her to go with God. He's given her a little blessing,
Yeah, and he tells Emmett you wouldn't understand, and a lot of what Gil and Roy are, a lot of opportunities that they miss to escape, they miss them because they do not want to endanger other people. And that's an important aspect of their characters, and something that separates them from Emmett Myers and their humanity, which slowly gets stripped away from them. And Roy definitely feels it more than Gil does. Gil is a very sort of stoic presence, while Roy is easier to get nettled and riled up. But it is their inherent humanity that saves them, and it is also their inherent humanity that puts them in danger, even down to the fact that they pull over to pick him up. Because they see that he's a guy who's run out of gas. And
also a thing that I think probably two female characters wouldn't do in a film, either in the 50s or set today. That struck me as well. I was like, this is not to, these are mostly nice sympathetic characters, but I was like, there's also an element of male privilege there, isn't there? Where, you see this guy on the road at night and you go, yeah, we'll pick him up. I mean, that is both a nice thing to do and kind of a dumb thing to do. Then they're not really paying attention. They're not really thinking it through. At the beginning of the movie.
Yeah. And there's a bit of innocence there, and a bit of the camaraderie of the road post-war, of helping people out, and not everyone has a car, and so that becomes more like in 1930s films. The way that hitchhiking is shown is not as inherently dangerous thing, and then as the years progress, it becomes more and more dangerous.
And this is part of the building block of that, I suppose, of that paranoia.
Yeah. There was a film in, I think, 47 called The Devil Thumbs a Ride that also dealt with evil hitchhiker. So the Hitchhiker definitely isn't the first, and I'm sure that there are more before that one.
Well, and I mentioned Wolf Creek, but obviously, I suppose the most literal analogue of this movie is I don't know if it's even thought of as a semi-remake, but, the Hitcher, the Rutger Hauer movie from the 80s, which is obviously a cult classic and, provides a variant on this with a darker, I suppose more of a, well, not darker, but, certainly more violent more take on the threat of the hitchhiker. Yeah, it's a fascinating kind of, the road being this symbol of American freedom, but also increasingly of risk and of strangers. And because the other thing I was thinking, to harp on the horror stuff again, Texas Chainsaw Massacre before too long introduces you to a scary hitchhiker, who terrorizes the kind of the band of young people in that movie, and he's I mean, even more obviously crazy than Emmett, but it's kind of become, by the early 70s, it's just this threat, isn't it? The hitchhikers are threats, or at least in mainstream cinema.
One film that doesn't... no, it does have a hitchhiker in it, but I did... The previous time that I watched The Hitchhiker, most recently before this one, was sort of as an unintended double feature with another film about two friends going off on a fishing trip to get away from their spouses, and ends up on the Mexican border, and that is Thelma and Louise. And actually, I do highly recommend The Hitchhiker as a double feature with Thelma and Louise. It's they make a nice little parallel, and the female friendship and the male friendship.
Yeah, I suppose the Thelma and Louise rewrite of The Hitchhiker would be that Roy and Gil actually vanquish Emmett within the first sort of 20 minutes, and then they go off on a lovers spree together. That would be the remake. Well, we all know what fishing trip is a metaphor for, really. If you have any final thoughts about The Hitchhiker, I think we'll revisit it probably in part 2 at times. But if you want any final thoughts on that, and then we can move on.
I just think it's a really fascinating film, and it's a good entry point if one has not really explored mid-century films directed by women. It is definitely the most famous one. I'm definitely starting you on easy mode in women directors with this double feature of Hitchhiker and Point Break. It's very stylish, beautifully shot. The cinematographer worked with Val Lewton on a lot of his horror films, so Nicholas Mizuraka. And it's just an intriguing look at masculinity in mid-century America.
It certainly is. Thoroughly seconded, and I'd encourage people to check it out, although, as I say, maybe not in the colorized version that I did. So let's take a short break, and then we'll be back to talk about, another terribly obscure female director, the Oscar-winning Kathryn Bigelow, and her movie Point Break. See you in a minute.
It's not tragic to die doing what you love.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Everybody freeze! Somebody move! Keep your hands up and your eyes down!
We are the ex-presidents.
FBI! Freeze!
Special Agent John, Utah, day number 1 in L.A. Welcome aboard.
You want to nail the bank robbers and be a big hero.
Definitely.
That's Bodhi. They call him the Bodhisattva.
You want the ultimate,
You gotta be willing to pay the ultimate price.
Short trust tomorrow. Next day outside the latest.
Everything moves in cycles. So twice a century, the ocean lets us know just how small we really are. It's the ultimate rush. There's nothing that comes close to it. Not even sex. Johnny has his own demons. Don't you, Johnny?
The ex-presidents are surfers.
Feel what the wave is doing. Then accept its energy, get in sync, and charge with it.
You two have produced exactly squat! During which time, the ex-presidents have robbed 2 more banks!
I can't describe what I'm feeling. This was never about money for us. It was about us against the system.
God, give me a fucking break! I am God!
When you shoot, you don't miss.
Don't fire! After you, Alphonse!
Fear causes hesitation. Hesitation will cause your worst fears to come true.
No!
Or you're getting too goddamn close to the surfing guru buddy of yours.
Adios, amigo! Caught my first tube this morning.
Welcome back, and pleasure to talk to you, Nannina, about the second of the 2 movies we're discussing tonight, which is the rather fabulous Point Break, the Kathryn Bigelow movie from 1991. Now, I'd heard about this a bit, and I was particularly aware of it as a sort of fun action movie from the 90s. I think I had it in some sort of Empire Film magazine, greatest crime movies of all time kind of magazine when I was a teenager. It was quite a cool movie when I was growing up, but also faintly silly. I was aware that, it had that sort of air about it, that it was, considered to be kind of out there and maybe a bit camp, I suppose, as I became a bit older and aware of what that meant. And it's funny, I was talking to a friend of mine who basically said that if you watch this, you will understand more of the reference points in Hot Fuzz, the Edgar Wright movie, which spoofs kind of male bonding crime thriller movies in cop films and things like that. And I do now get more of those jokes. Do you want to tell me? I mean, we'll obviously talk about Kathryn Bigelow and, as a director, and that's part of the reason you've chosen this. Do you want to tell me about you and Point Break and your affection for this movie?
Ooh, so I did not watch it that early in my life. It's been around since I was a little kid, but I watched it for the first time, I think, in about 2010, and I don't think I really knew what hit me initially. But I knew that I liked it, and I knew I related to it quite a lot. And just from the opening credits, the combination of sort of sound and quiet, and it opens with Bodhi surfing and Johnny Utah doing a practice sort of target test in the rain. And so there's like the water that the surfboard's on and the water coming down in the rain, and one scene's dark and the other scene's light, and it's just beautifully shot. And I think that opening credit sequence really drew me into this being something kind of special. But it also, as you made reference to, there are deeply silly aspects to this movie. It is a movie about an FBI agent infiltrating bank robbing surfers.
Yes.
And the thing about this movie, and one of the tensions surrounding it, is that it's actually a fairly prosaic screenplay elevated by absolutely masterful direction. And if this film were directed by pretty well anyone else, it would not be the film that it was made. It would be The Fast and the Furious, actually, is what it would be.
Which I think people have pointed out that The Fast and the Furious is, the first one at least, is a kind of virtual remake of this in some respects.
Yeah, the producer of The Fast and Furious acknowledged to the screenwriter of Point Break that it was basically a remake. And there are even places that are used as filming locations for both. Like, it is an homage, but it's a not very veiled homage.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say that... I know that Fast and Furious is a beloved franchise and all of that, but I wouldn't say that it is in any way as interesting or as beautifully shot or as ambiguous as Point Break is.
Yeah, and I think it's also weirdly for a movie that's so is so silly and so camp and I want to talk about the perhaps over obvious queer reading of it, which I'm sure we will be far from the first people to point out. But I think there's something wonderfully heartfelt, heart on its sleeve about it as well. I mean, I think it comes out particularly during the skydiving scene. The first skydiving scene, I guess you'd say, but which kind of almost took my breath away a little bit, not just the spectacle of it, but kind of just by how sweet it is. It's talk about male bonding. Obviously, we talked about that a bit in the first half, but we'll return to that.
That skydiving scene is one of the most transcendent scenes in cinema, and it's just absolutely gorgeous, and there is that silly, unreal aspect to it in that they can talk to each other while doing it. In the screenplay, it does say they have headsets, though we don't really see that at all. But just few films have been able to get across the seductive quality of the adrenaline rush. And yes, that is both embodied in the character of Bodhi, played by Patrick Swayze, but also just in how Kathryn Bigelow films these incredibly fluid scenes of both skydiving and surfing, and just how beautiful these scenes are, and the elation and the euphoria in them. It's absolutely transcendent.
Yeah, I want to kind of talk about Keanu and then sort of lead into talking about Swayze, because I think that, you obviously have to talk about both of them and the chemistry that sort of carries this as almost as much as the direction. And we will, we'll never quite leave Bigelow alone as well. We'll keep coming back to kind of what she brings to it, because I want to talk about that a bit in terms of the things it reminded me of as well, and the things that, a little bit about her later career, as much as we'll have time to touch on it. Firstly, can we just start by acknowledging what a wonderful name Johnny Utah is? And what I love about it is that it's it's obviously like, on a basic level, it's like a badass action name, and it's an inversion of the sort of Indiana Jones formula, and it's redolent of that. But it's great, isn't it? Because the Johnny is cool, but it's also kind of infantilizing a little bit. It's like he's little Johnny. Like he's not quite matured yet. But also, Utah is just such a wonderful. All due respect to any of our listeners in Utah, it's such a wonderful state to pick, isn't it? Because it's basically the square state. That's what it conveys. And again, all due respect to listeners, but that's the image of that state, isn't it? It's not full of worldly cool people, and that's part of who he is as well. He's the character who's kind of part of the establishment. He's the All-American football player. He's the young FBI rookie. He's a collection of character cliches in some respects. But I don't think I've ever been so aware of the charm of Keanu Reeves carrying something, because I'm not one of those people who worships Keanu Reeves. I know he's so beloved now, and he's such a cult figure in many things. And this is around the time when it was kind of very easy to mock him. For Bill and Ted, for Bram Stoker's Dracula. For some things in which it probably is right to mock him a little bit. I was really impressed by him in this. I thought he was really, really good. In not a Shakespeare role, obviously, but it was fun. He was heartfelt. He's obviously spectacularly handsome, but he's charming in it.
Yeah, a few people have been as good looking as Keanu Reeves is in Point Break, and I've always been a fan of Keanu Reeves. The time that my sister Melly was kind of a little bit obsessed with him after seeing Speed, so she then showed me Speed at a younger age than perhaps I should, but she showed me an edited version out of sequence. So Speed has been very much a formative movie for me, and I wholeheartedly believe that Keanu Reeves is the action star of the 90s. He has Point Break at the beginning of the 90s, he has Speed in the middle, and he has The Matrix at the end of the 90s. And so he is my quintessential 90s action star.
Yeah, I'd never really thought how he does buttress the decade like that, doesn't he? I definitely see, because I love Speed as well and saw that when I was much younger. I definitely see more now why he got Speed. and like, you know, why that works in a sense, but building on the back of Point Break partly. You know.
The name Johnny Utah is very much also influenced by American football culture, where Joe Montana was the big football player of that era and kind of a hero of the screenwriter of Point Break. So that is where he got the name from, and he's very proud of the name, as he should be.
An element definitely lost on me. That's I'm glad that you told me about that.
Yeah.
I mean, the way he couldn't work as well as he does in this movie without playing off Swayze, and it's funny because Swayze, in some ways, I'm a child of the 80s. I was literally born in the 80s. Obviously, imbibed a lot of 80s pop culture in the 90s and all that kind of stuff. You know, kind of grew up on a lot of it. But like a lot of people my age, I have 80s nostalgia blind spots as well. You know, I have kind of. I didn't see, for example, or to take what we're talking about, I didn't see Dirty Dancing until I was, you know, in my early 20s, you know, and then I watched it with a partner back at university or just afterwards and really enjoyed it and really liked it. I can't say it was specifically him that sold it, Swayze that sold it, but I did enjoy it as a movie. And the thing that actually finally sold me on Swayze, like really, and sort of I sort of got what people were talking about and why people liked him so much, you know, was it was only about 6 years ago, I guess. I went to a screening of Roadhouse. It's funny you mentioned another Roadhouse in part one. I instantly, my ears picked up. And I'd never seen that before, but again, was aware, you know, it was this, you know, I guess almost like the male film fan Dirty Dancing of the 80s, you know, like people loved it and, you know, thought it was ridiculous, but also had a lot of affection for it. And I completely got why. I watched it going and knowing very little about it. I was like, this is probably one of the silliest things I've ever seen, but it's great, you know, and he's great in it, and it's funny, and it's ludicrous, you know. But you know, for anyone who hasn't seen Roadhouse, I genuinely recommend it. It's not a hot take exactly, but it's a lot of fun if you haven't seen it. And it. I
haven't. I've only seen the 1940s, not inspiration for it.
Well, you should watch it as well because it's a lot. You know, if you like, I'm not saying it's as good as Point Break necessarily, but it's certainly like lower budget, you know, and kind of. But if you like. If the charm of Swayze in this does anything for you, you'll enjoy Roadhouse, and it is very silly. You know, it's how to make like a story of a nightclub bouncer be epic, and it's got a kind of weird heart on its sleeve kind of quality to it as well. It's kind of a cute movie in the same way that this is as well. You know, but yeah, Swayze in this because obviously he's playing the. You know, I guess either way around, the yang to the yin of Keanu's character. You know, he's playing the surfer guy who's also a crime boss, which is on the surface of it ridiculous, but also
spoilers.
But also okay. Well, this is the thing actually, because that is them being the gang of the ex-presidents is meant to be a bit of a twist in this movie. But I was to the extent that I was aware of this movie, I was aware that it was the Keanu versus Patrick Swayze kind of movie where that was the cops and robbers side of it. That was the Heat sort of formula, and so that so I was a bit spoiled on this movie to that extent, but you could probably see it coming. I think I would say
the preview gives it away. Like the marketing of the movie gave away that central twist, one might say. One interesting thing about the film, though, is that other than the opening credits, Bodhi appears it's something like 20 minutes into the film before the character of Bodhi appears at all. And it's such a charismatic performance and such an interesting character that it really feels like it's a two-hander, and it is very much. But and Patrick Swayze, I think, had top billing because he was the biggest male star in the world. He was coming off of Ghost, and Keanu was none of the producers wanted it to go to Keanu. It was Kathryn Bigelow who said no, he's the right guy for this role. And
because putting 91 Keanu Reeves in a film with a cop versus a surfer and not making him the surfer part of that equation is kind of a interesting move, isn't it? You know, if you take the
I mean, he was known for Bill and Ted, and that was a certain amount of celebrity. That it was a big cult film, especially with the advent of VHS and all of that. But it was not a film that really made one think that Keanu could become the action star of the 90s. As we already established, he did.
It's such an interesting polarity between their characters in this movie, isn't it? Because they are kind of, on one level I was thinking, particularly when you think about, various moments of confrontation throughout it, but kind of how much they start to mean to each other and the sort of epic feel, the grandeur of their sort of enmity, I suppose, as it turns out in friendship. That there is a sort of Holmes-Moriarty point to it, isn't there? And I was thinking that, in terms of the conclusion and things like that. But there's also, I suppose that's part of, if you're to take the twist seriously, part of introducing Bodhi relatively late and quite low key as this kind of, spiritual guru kind of. He's introduced like a supporting character, like someone who's going to be a supporting character who teaches you some wisdom and you have a few laughs with, and is ultimately quite tangential, and obviously he isn't that. And that's interesting. But they're also such fascinating characters to play off each other, aren't they, to take them seriously, because like they both could be seen as the sort of more naive, unworldly one in different ways. Obviously Bodhi he's a hippie, basically. He's a hippie surfer with these, sort of vaguely Asian philosophy kind of ideals, and like kind of living in the moment, kind of outside the rat race kind of ideas and practices. He's also a hardened criminal, who doesn't mind people getting hurt, in the pursuit of his own pleasures and hedonism and stuff. And as I said, like Johnny Utah is also he's naive. He's kind of all American. He's idealistic. He's clean cut. But he's also got a lot to learn, and he has the wool pulled over his eyes, and he makes some kind of shockingly silly decisions in this, and it's kind of, but he's also very astute in other ways. They're such an interesting pair to balance off each other, aren't they?
They really are. They're a great complement, and just the physicality of them are very different. Keanu's very sort of lithe and with his dark hair, and then Swayze is lithe in that he's a dancer, but he's more bulked up for the role, and being this blonde surfer archetype, and the way they fight is very different. Keanu's fighting style is more of a brawler, actually, while I find quite amusing Bodhi, he fights like a kung fu fighter, sort of incorporating his various sort of Orientalist philosophies into his fighting style of co-opting and these other cultures in this way that makes him seem cool, but also is kind of appropriatistic as well.
Oh, a little bit, yeah. But he's that kind of character. He's, I mean, he is a ridiculous character, but he is sort of that kind of character, isn't he? He is the character to appropriate these things, and the movie kind of acknowledges that and knows that. And it's funny to look ahead to Keanu's career as well. You mentioned The Matrix before. There is something of the kung fu character about them, isn't there? He is sort of a master in that sense. He has wisdom, and he's formidable, and he's to be overcome ultimately. But obviously Johnny falls in love with him with a sort of, he has a worship of him, but also respect for him and his knowledge. That's part of it. But he's also very, you talk about the physicality of Swayze. He has got that mane of blonde hair, and he's got the beard, and he's quite leonine, isn't he? He seems like kind of like a prophet. He's presented that way.
Yeah, we were talking about male friendship in The Hitch-Hiker, and I think that Point Break is an incredible sort of deconstruction of male friendship and the various aspects of bravado and tenderness and machoism and care.
You like to start shit, don't you?
Who are those guys?
Nazi assholes. The guy you dropped is Bunker Weiss. The big one is War Child, a.k.a. Lupton Pittman. The other two, hell, I don't know. They think there's some kind of death squad around here.
What's their program?
Brains are wired wrong. They're into some bad shit.
Like what? Illegal shit?
Maybe, I don't know. That's not what I'm talking about. They only live to get radical. They don't have any real understanding of the sea, so they'll never get the spiritual side of it.
Hey, you're not gonna start chanting or anything, are you?
I might.
This is me.
So, you still haven't figured out what riding waves is all about, have you? It's a state of mind. It's that place where you lose yourself and you find yourself. You don't know it yet, but you got it. It's right there. I saw you with those guys. You're a pit bull. You didn't hesitate, and they didn't back you down an inch. And that is very rare in this world.
Well, thanks for stepping in.
De nada. Later. Oh, hey, I'm having some people over at my house tonight if you want to come.
Sure. Where?
Come with Tyler, she knows.
All right.
It's fascinating and it's beautiful, and in the end, it is also subverted. And I think a lot of that is credit to Kathryn Bigelow, and I think that she was able to see the hypocrisy in Bodhi that I don't get the sense that the male producers or screenwriter did see, at least in the interviews that I've seen with them. I think a lot of them buy into Bodhi a lot more than the film does. And I find that a lot of male viewers that I know unironically buy into Bodhi as this heroic character fighting against those people trapped in their metal coffins on the freeway.
Yeah. Well, there's something of like, in terms of film culture and film bro culture, arguably as well. There's something of sort of Ledger's Joker in there, isn't there? Somewhere, like it's kind of. I'm not, obviously very different characters in many respects, but seeing this sort of, the outlaw, isn't it? It's whatever that means in different decades of our world. Bodhi is that kind of character, and if you do take him seriously, you would buy into a lot of that, or you'd have to. But it also doesn't shy away from the fact that, as I say, he's brutal. He's contemptible. He doesn't care a jot for human life, really.
Well, he pretends that he does, though, and he is shown by the end to be very much a hypocrite and not standing up for the values that he claims that he stands for. And I think that there's a lot of emphasis placed on the relationship between Johnny Utah and Bodhi, and that obviously is hugely important to the film, and a lot of emphasis placed on the homoerotic undertones to that friendship. But when I was trying to sell this movie to you, I very much said that it, rather than being a gay movie, it's a bisexual movie, because I do think that the importance of Lori Petty's character, Tyler, is not incidental. And I think she is a hugely fascinating character that was pulled out of the script. She's very flat on the script and is just described as basically this exquisite blonde surfer goddess, which is not what Kathryn Bigelow saw and is not how Lori Petty embodied her on screen. But the relationship between Tyler and Johnny Utah is, I think, very important to the film and often gets sort of underemphasized within the more out there chemistry between Patrick Swayze and Keanu, and the deliberate sort of ambiguous styling of both Keanu and Lori Petty. They're kind of similar. He has slightly longer hair than hers, and they're a bit mirrors of each other.
Yeah, she's sort of gaming, isn't she? And she's not asexual. She's a feminine lady and very beautiful, but she is styled slightly androgynously, and there's that feel of it. I like your nuanced reading of it as bisexual, because I was just going to joke that the most subversive thing you can do to Point Break is give it a straight reading. That would be maybe that would be the subversive thing.
Not a straight reading.
No, I know. Nor would you ever do such a thing. But I think maybe some of why she suffers, apart from just the fact that it's a lot of fun to ship, Johnny and Bodhi, is she does disappear from the movie. She's not fridged, but she's taken hostage, and thus is not in the whole last quarter of the movie, essentially, if not third.
Yes, and that, in a way, that sidelining of her character does it a disservice, but it also shows the inherent misogyny of Bodhi's character that is just under the surface. And I think part of the reason why I relate so deeply to Point Break and love this movie so much is that I've been on the periphery of a few different extreme sports. I don't really think of rock climbing as being an extreme sport, but I enjoy it. I'm not a great rock climber, but I'm a decent one, and it's a sport that I've done since I was a kid. And then I also have been on the periphery of the hang gliding community and attempted to hang glide, barely got off the ground, literally and figuratively, but I was involved in that for about a year. And these sports can have a very macho element to them. I think that rock climbing is, in general, quite a feminine sport in some ways, but often the atmosphere surrounding it, if you are not in a group with women, can be quite macho, and emphasis on sort of strength and powering through. And with hang gliding, there is that element of risk and reward and
transcendence as well,
transcendence as well. And there's this incredible scene in Point Break where they're on the beach at a fire during a party and talking about the biggest waves that they've surfed and what is the biggest wave and all of that. And Tyler is there, and she is a very good surfer. And at one point, I think it is Bodhi who says it's not a tragedy if you die doing what you love. And Tyler gets up and says, "Too much testosterone here," and walks away. And I relate to that deeply.
Yeah, I thought you might.
And yeah, she comes across as, just a real human being, a recognizable human being, that the ways that she has to have the bravado and has to be in a very masculine situation and has to be the best in these situations, but also the ways that she pulls back and what she's not willing to do. And
I love it. Maybe again, one of the most, if you like, bisexual moments in the movie is, I think it's before, I might be wrong, but I think it's before Bodhi's unmasked as the leader of the ex-presidents, but he, not literally unmasked, obviously, but, we'll talk a bit about the ex-presidents as well and the imagery there, but it's the bit where he's talking to Johnny and he acknowledges that she sees more in him than he ever saw in Bodhi, because they're ex-lover characters, and he says that with an air of sadness a little bit, but also generosity of like, you're in some ways you're a better person than me, and she sees that as well, and it's where you sort of get that Bodhi has an inkling of self-awareness that he is a bit lacking, maybe, or just she likes him better, as well. That even for some guys, even just to acknowledge that is unusually tender and generous, in male friendships, so it's but then obviously, it's he's cataloging that as something he can exploit, which he then does, as you say, to horrible, misogynistic and violent ends, and it's just a really interesting portrait for something that's quite comic booky in some ways, and could be completely shallow. It's just so well sketched. Also before, because I want to talk to you more about the movie and the visuals and Bigelow as well, and I think we should end the segment by you sort of giving a bit of a praise of what you think about Bigelow in general. I think because that we could do another hour on that, I'm sure, but like we'll talk about an overview. Should just also acknowledge that Gary Busey is in this film. Yeah. Because that's it's not full on crazy Busey. It's him up to a good 7 or something, I'd say, and he's more eccentric in this than full on crazy, but he's a lot of fun, isn't he? And Busey around this time is a particular pleasure of mine. Talking about things like like Under Siege and Predator 2, and like just loads of fun stuff that he crops up in that I've seen earlier in my life, and this is now added to my Busey list, because he's fun, isn't he? And he's kind of he's another sort of stock character. He's the slightly down on his luck older detective, the eccentric, but he's also the father figure. He's kind of the Obi-Wan Kenobi in some respects, he's and he literally becomes a figure of he becomes fridged, essentially. Again, we're spoiling the movie, but he's bringing his A game as well, isn't he? He's got a lot of charm.
Yeah, and a lot of humor to his character as well. and the way that his big personality bounces off Keanu's very contained personality, it makes for a nice tension between the two. The scene where Keanu gets, or Johnny Utah gets Pappas all riled up with overlooking the LA skyline, and Keanu's needling him until he gets angry and allows for Boosie to go Boosie. And
it's the washed up cop. It's the washed up cop who the rookie can see something better in, isn't it? It's that old cliche as well. If like you can bring out the best in someone who's kind of lost their way a bit, lost their ideals, and
I was interested to see, though, that scene was not in the version of the screenplay that I was able to peruse. And I think that scene was very much working off of the actors that were there and bringing out character and motivation through the strengths of the actors and their idiosyncrasies.
Yeah, no, quite possibly. That's so interesting you talk about reading a version of the script, because I want to kind of get this out of the way, because I think this is kind of an elephant in the room, particularly when we're sort of, we're talking about this for part of the reason we're talking about it. James Cameron. Because I see just from perusing the Wikipedia for this movie that it sort of casually mentions that Bigelow developed, quote unquote, developed the script with husband James Cameron.
And he's a producer on it.
Yeah, he is, and I don't think he has a formal co-writing credit. But I was wondering if you had any insight at all into what the level of his input was, and if possible, any specifics. Because I see some things in this that are. And again, I don't want to dilute Bigelow's achievement in this movie. I see some things in this that can chime with some of Cameron's work around the same time. And actually, I was thinking, because I was, again, you could talk about, speed and things like that, things that's a bit like, the Cameron thing this reminded me of a little bit was in sort of its ridiculousness, but sort of emotional intensity and stuff. And I think this is a better movie, I should state. It's True Lies. A few years later, and that very much is the straight version of this, where it's it's about a straight couple, and it's about the weird situations they get into, and it's about husband and wife, and it's about how they learn to appreciate each other again, and everything like that. But it's got a kind of similar, almost like daring you to not find it completely ludicrous, but with an emotional core to it. And again, I think this is the more sophisticated version. But do you have any insight about that?
Well, so just from my part of the reason why I dug into the screenplay is my fascination at, really, as I said before, all respect to Peter Iliff, but I think there are few movies as great as Point Break that have as mediocre a screenplay. Like there are plot issues that I don't care about watching it, but just the way that Utah and Pappas do their undercover operation is really, Utah is doing it under his name, like fully his own identity. He
that's very James Bond.
Apparently deep undercover as Johnny Utah, former football star.
Yeah. Everything about the undercover investigation is ridiculous.
Yeah, and the raid that they do at the sort of surf Nazis' house that it turns out aren't the ex-president, shockingly. That is the dumbest, like, why would they even be allowed to get a warrant for that raid? They have no evidence against them other than they beat up Johnny Utah, and seem to be into some bad shit. This is not necessarily the best.
That reminded me of the joke in The Naked Gun where the mayor of LA is reprimanding Frank Drebin for shooting some Shakespeare in the park actors who were doing Julius Caesar. You killed 3 actors, good ones. It's as ludicrous as anything in the Naked Gun trilogy. I was actually stunned again to Bigelow's direction. That scene, that whole sequence of that raid, though, is very visceral and actually kind of like thrilling, but also pretty dark and violent, and I guess because these guys, we're not meant to feel any sympathy for these guys, so you can really rough them up, and they do get roughed up, and it's got that whole lawnmower climax to it, where Keanu's face is, talking about the merits of his face, is put dangerously close to the lawnmower blades, and I was like,
most terrifying lawnmower ever.
well, I had no idea about that scene, and I was like, well, I know he's not going to get put in the lawnmower, but I'm still there with the film, like I'm still feeling it.
And so, her direction is propping up a scene that, on the face of it, is ludicrous and is not really that well motivated by the script. So what I do know is that James Cameron and Kathryn Bigelow did a pass on the script, and the script that I read was credited to them based on the screenplay by Peter Iliff. But if you notice the credits of the film, it is fully credited to Peter Iliff as the screenwriter and Rich King and Peter Iliff as story. So when it came to arbitration, Kathryn Bigelow and James Cameron did not change that script enough to get a credit. Okay. And it basically, they would have had to change about 60% of it. What I do know from an interview with the screenwriter is that one of James Cameron's big contributions to the film that Peter Iliff is a little bit like, is the second skydiving scene where Johnny Utah jumps out of the plane without a parachute. That was James Cameron's idea. And James Cameron was like, he has the gun, but he can't pull the ripcord because it would mean that he'd have to let go of Bodhi and all of that. Which I'm kind of like, why actually does he need a gun?
It's a bit, that's moment? Also very thrilling, but it's a bit contrived. Yeah. Even in the moment, I was like, I'm not sure if that works really.
Yeah, but the way that all of this is shot, it pulls you viscerally over it. And again, all credit to Kathryn Bigelow. I feel that a lot of times, a lot of people can be very strongly, the director is the auteur of the film, until it comes to early Kathryn Bigelow, when people are like, oh, James Cameron's Point Break and James Cameron's Strange Days. It's like...
Well, no, I was not doing that. And I was deliberately trying not to do that as well. But yeah.
But that is something that does happen. And I kind of wonder how much of an influence Kathryn Bigelow is on James Cameron's work. I think that it's a two-way street for them.
Yeah, well, their shared fascination with spectacle, I think, and that is something, the skydiving scenes, as you say, and just the sort of thrill of those being this roller coaster ride. You can see that in both of their work. That's I can see that cropping up in her later work as well. And we'll, as I say, I'll give you that overview, a chance of an overview.
Point Break, which is just such a fantastic, a lot of stunts in that. I mean, that was an intense stunt movie, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was actually probably my big break for doing action films. And it was the first time that I got into training for a role, lifting the weights, running, learning the weapons, some skydiving. So that was really my introduction. And then, and also I got to work with Patrick Swayze, who's a legend. And there we are.
But don't they have stunt people that can do
Well, what's cool is that Patrick actually started jumping, he trained, and then he kept diving while we were filming. And eventually the production had to give him a cease and desist.
You mean he was diving for fun?
He was diving for fun.
Recreational?
Yeah, he was playing a character named Bodhi, and he was the leader of this, bank robbing tribe.
Yeah.
And then he got the other actors, so they all started jumping out of planes while they were filming, and production was like, what are you guys doing? And Patrick is like, I'm just jumping out of planes. And so they stopped
This is just
him.
for make-believe we want you to do this.
No, Patrick was a leader, man. And then at the end of the filming, Patrick and the director, Kathryn Bigelow, got a cameraman, and then he jumped out of the plane. And then when you see him doing all the flips in the sky, that's all him. And then for me, I just jumped out once.
That's enough. Once is enough.
Smart.
Yeah.
No. Well, I figured that was what my path was.
What was the feeling like when you jumped out of the plane?
The best part is when they're 1, 2, 3, and then you leap out.
Yeah?
For me, that was the best.
Really?
Yeah.
But yours was the worst part.
No, that's the best part. That's
And
the
you're
best
not.
part.
I mean, obviously, you're not tied to anybody.
Yeah, I got to jump solo because I did like the advance. Yeah, I didn't do tandem. I jumped at 12.5.
12.5.
Yeah, and so that was the best part.
12.5.
I don't even know what that means,
Neither
but
do
it
I.
sounds deadly.
12,500 feet above the earth.
Yeah.
You leap out of the plane with a pack on your back.
But how do you
pull
know
a handle.
how do you know when to pull the?
Well, that was the fun part, is because I was like, I jumped out, and then I started like looking around, and I was hanging out, and then you jump with two jump masters, and I look over, and he's looking at me, and he's like, and he's looking at his clock, and I'm like, yeah, and I'm hanging out, and then I look over, and he's like,
it's time.
Yeah. On my first jumps, because I started just to look around, and then I got the memo and was like, oh yeah, and then I had a blank moment. I was like, okay, what do I? Oh yeah, right. Push.
I would have pulled my chute in the plane. That's how afraid of that I am.
No, it's fantastic. You must do
Really?
it.
The visuals of this movie are incredible, and there is a kind of, I guess, like post-Miami Vice kind of sheen of weird, dreamlike glamour to the whole film. And, you know, the ex-presidents, I was aware of them as being one of the iconic features of the film. You know, these masked, the bank robbers, the surfers, when they're robbing the banks, have these, like, cheap Halloween store latex masks on of the sort of most recent ex-presidents at the time. Because this was made in the Bush presidency, wasn't it? So, you know, this is Reagan being the most recent ex-president, and that is the mask that Bodhi wears, isn't it? Yeah. Again, spoilers. That sequence when they stumble upon that bank robbery. I love that. I love the joke of when they're going out for the sandwich, and it's like a Monty Python joke or something where the bank robbers roll up in the background, just like round the corner.
But it's also beautifully shot and precisely timed.
Yeah.
Like both, it's a great sight gag, but also points to Kathryn Bigelow's precise way of framing shots and timing shots.
Oh, definitely. And you know what? It's funny as you know, because you do see more of the bank robberies in this than the film I'm about to credit. But it's only in talking to you about this that I've realised that another film that comes out, I think, the same year, or it's certainly in the same zone of the early 90s as this, is Reservoir Dogs. I was thinking about that when I was thinking of some of the banter that Johnny and Pappas have in the car and stuff like that. I was like, you know, Tarantino didn't emerge out of a vacuum. You know, that there was a sort of jokey, pop culturally astute sort of savviness to these dialogue scenes creeping in, and you know, whatever you think of the screenplay overall, there's an energy there. But obviously, Reservoir Dogs famously being a film where you don't see the central bank robbery, you know, but you see a lot of the fallout. But the ex-presidents are great visually, and again, it's silly, but it's also scary. They are scary characters, and their violence is scary, and particularly in the bank robbery that Johnny's along for later in the movie, you know, where things start going a bit west and Bodhi gets more vicious and he gets more calculating, and more people get shot. Basically, they start to go off script, and it's striking. And you know, I think I messaged you, didn't I, with a visual or a gif of, I can't remember, it's the Reagan masked bank robber, but like, you know, they've got the gasoline, what do you call it, the petrol pump, as we'd call it in the UK, and they're spraying fire, using it as a flamethrower to torch their getaway vehicle. And I was like, this is insane imagery, you know, in a good way. Like,
no one films fire the way Kathryn Bigelow films fire. She is a pyro, I'm sure. Like, in all of her film, like, Near Dark has some amazing scenes with fire and explosions. I mean, Hurt Locker is built entirely around explosions. Like, and those scenes with the Reagan blowtorching a car with a gas pump it's just beautiful and weird, and it kind of stops the movie for this breath that you're just kind of admiring this image.
This is what I meant by post-Miami Vice, because it kind of does become a music video for a moment, doesn't it? And but in a way where you're not complaining, because it's so dreamlike and appealing, you know, and scary.
Yeah, but I think that it's also like the image, like, it's not an accident that it's Reagan in that mask, and it's this surreal imagery is also commentary as well. It's a fascinating scene. And in this original screenplay, it was the dead presidents, so it was like Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln and people like that. And it was apparently another James Cameron addition to update it to the most recent presidents.
Yeah. Well, the spectacle, I mean, an obvious joke, the spectacle of Nixon, doing the I am not a crook iconography whilst, literally committing a bank robbery is brilliant. But also, I just like I was trying to read into other stuff about the recent presidents, and I guess maybe slightly less obvious but interesting is the Reagan thing of, Reagan being this then extremely revered, just out of office kind of, father figure of the nation, like the most popular American leader of the 80s, obviously. And it's Reagan obviously being this fascinating figure himself who moved around in terms of his politics and, started out as this, well, not bohemian actor necessarily, but, an actor, which would be seen as incredibly anti-establishment and bohemian, and a union man, etc., who drifted rightwards and became the ultimate establishment figure. And that kind of hinting at some of the duality there between Johnny and Bodhi, and for Bodhi to inhabit that mask is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, that scene is just fantastic. And then it's immediately followed by the foot chase, which is one of the most dynamic chase scenes ever put on screen. And basically what it involved was having the cinematographer carrying a fairly lightweight camera, running at the same speed as Swayze's stunt double, who was in the mask, and Keanu, going through this quite elaborate choreography around these maze-like streets. And I think that one thing that connects Kathryn Bigelow and Ida Lupino is that they're both masters of the point of view shot, and Kathryn Bigelow then took that to an extreme in Strange Days, where large sections of the film are very dynamic point of view, often disturbing point of view filmmaking. And one thing that Kathryn Bigelow and James Cameron both had in common is the drive to technologically push forward the medium. And so the pogo camera that they used for Point Break is sort of a forerunner to the extremely lightweight camera they needed to develop for the action scenes in Strange Days. And so Kathryn Bigelow is very much an innovator on the technical side of cinema, as is James Cameron.
It's just that he's a water Pokemon and she's a fire Pokemon, as we've
exactly.
Exactly. That's probably why it couldn't last as well,
Yeah.
But well, that's a great springboard into, because I just want to hear you. You can touch on Point Break again, but I just want to hear you talk a little bit about your view of Bigelow overall. Obviously, you've hinted at some of her qualities already as a director, and I guess some of her work before this, and obviously she's had very storied, Oscar-winning, pioneeringly Oscar-winning work since then, which may or may not be amongst your favourites. In fact, I would like you to say if Point Break isn't your favourite Bigelow movie, what is? And if Point Break is your favourite Bigelow movie, what would be the runner-up? But if you want to speak to any of that as you wish.
Well, so the first Kathryn Bigelow film I saw was actually K-19 The Widowmaker, which is not one of her most well-received ones. And I saw it in theaters because it came out when I was 16 and I was a huge Harrison Ford fan, basically.
Yep, you're only human.
Yeah. It was Harrison Ford and Liam Neeson on Russian Sub. And I've only seen that movie once, so it's been quite a few years. But I remember being very moved by it, and fascinated by it. And it was one of the first films that I knowingly went to the theater knowing that it was directed by a woman. I have to admit that as a teenager, I was not very aware of female directors, and I was always aware of female writers because I come from a line of that, but I sort of projected my own disinterest in directing onto women in general, and I was like, women aren't directors because they don't want to be. It would be something that I actually would have said as a teenager. And I have grown and learned since then, and it is possible. But
as a brief sidebar to that, you just got me thinking what my first movie I would have seen where I would have been aware that it was a female director, and I was too young to see it at the cinema or not brave enough. But when American Psycho came out in 2000, I was aware, I think from reading film magazines, that was directed by a woman, and that would have been, I would have seen it on DVD or VHS, but that was probably the first one where I had an awareness of that.
And I definitely saw Clueless well before I saw K-19 The Widowmaker, but yeah, so Kathryn Bigelow is part of my sort of development in looking at women directors, and I then saw at the Edinburgh Film Festival actually The Hurt Locker, and The Hurt Locker is my second favorite, I think, of Kathryn Bigelow's films. I think it is a fascinating, amazing film of, again, male friendship and machoism and tragedy and addiction. And I think that it is a fascinating, beautifully shot film. And I also do rate Strange Days up there among her films. It is a hard one to watch. I don't know if you've seen Strange Days.
I've not, and I've also not seen Near Dark, which is the one I really want to correct ASAP, because that's one of those I've been meaning to watch it for literally about 25 years now. Movies.
And Near Dark is another interesting one of like who had influence on whom. With a lot of the cast in Near Dark is also in Aliens.
I had read that. Yeah. That's one small reason I'm keen to see it.
But. Yeah, so I was very much pulling for The Hurt Locker to win Best Picture and Best Director, and I think that Kathryn Bigelow is a really fascinating director and a really masterful one.
Did you see? I was curious because we probably don't have time to get into Zero Dark 30 and all its complexity and kind of mixed reputation for various reasons. I just wondered, actually, have you seen her? I think apparently still latest feature, Detroit, because I that kind of passed me by completely, I must admit.
I've been wanting to, but I have not seen that one yet.
Right.
And I keep on thinking, I should watch Detroit.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd like to hear takes on that. I think Near Dark, I kind of want to see, partly to contrast it with The Lost Boys, which again is an 80s movie that I hadn't seen until recent years, and I now really want to see what the other kind of iconic late 80s vampire movie in contemporary America is, and I think that'd be a lot of fun.
It's a definitely less polished, scrappier, more independent feeling film than Point Break, which Point Break is hugely polished, but as I said, there are some amazing scenes of fire, and it does interesting things.
We've uncovered something here
as she's developing as a director. But Point Break's my favorite. Point Break is one of my favorite movies ever made. I think that it is brilliant. I think that it is perfect in all of its imperfections. I think it is fascinating, and I think it is gorgeous.
So nearly as good as First Night.
That's
a reference to a previous episode.
First, yeah, which we went into. That First Night is deeply flawed. Not as flawed as the 2015 remake of Point Break, where they thought that actually what the point of Point Break was the extreme sports angle, and where it really failed was that Point Break only had surfing and skydiving, and they could improve on it by adding all sorts of other extreme sports, and it is one of the worst movies I have ever seen.
Yeah, I read about that. It sounds dreadful, and seems to make the from what I read about the way the plot structured in that, it seems to make the mistake of thinking that Johnny Utah's character should be into extreme sports from the start, whereas surely the pleasure is him not being adapting to that and learning, and I don't know. It sounds dreadful.
I hate to admit that I gave them money and saw it in theaters because I thought it would be so bad it was good, and it was just so bad that I wanted to punch everyone involved in that movie.
Yeah, you wanted to have a fight in the surf with whoever caused that movie to exist. I was actually going to ask you if you had seen the remake, so I'm glad you confessed before I had to push you.
Yeah. And one thing that I think is interesting in terms of the remake and the original is the remake really emphasized the fact that they were actually doing all of the sports, and the gritty realism of especially the stunt of they have a squirrel suit scene of people doing the absolutely insane, stupid thing of wingsuit flying, which if you're going to fly, do hang gliding or paragliding. Don't do squirrel suit. You will die. But they did that actual stunt and they filmed it, and the scene is like a Red Bull ad where yes, they are actually doing it, but you get none of the transcendence that you get in the scene in the original where they're skydiving, and there's a great combination of both actual skydiving footage and of Hollywood magic, where they created this sort of support system so that each of the actors were mobile, and there was a giant fan, and the camera was on a similar support that was mobile, and they could move the whole system around. Again, in Kathryn Bigelow sort of developing things on a technical side to bring her vision to the screen, that is so much realer and more visually appealing, even though it isn't actually real, than the fact that in the remake they did 60 jumps, I think, in order to get the squirrel suit scene. And yes, that is takes an insane amount of skill in order to film that scene, but it is not visually dynamic. It is, you don't get the euphoria that Johnny Utah experiences in that scene, and they forget that film is not just spectacle, it's about the characters, and the point of that scene is to show the sort of seduction of the adrenaline rush and the fact that Johnny has gone from a low point of Tyler leaving him, having been unmasked as a federal agent. He has an injured knee, which, all credit to the film, he maintains that injured knee. When damage happens in Point Break, it is permanent. Like,
yeah.
If people get hurt, then they are hurt.
There's another male vulnerability touch to it as well, isn't it? You know, these people are, they kind of are superheroes when the plot requires it, but he's a somewhat weakened superhero.
So he's gotten from a low point to this sort of almost being kidnapped and feeling like he's very well might get killed, to this absolute euphoric literal high.
Yet without quite being out of the threat of being killed yet as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And then is brought down again by the gut punch of this being diversionary tactics so that they can get to Tyler and blackmail him, basically. So just the amount of emotions that are going through these scenes is so vital to them actually working, and how the film is shot and how it's structured, and the combination of the silly fantasy and also the realism of when people get shot, it hurts. And when they get injured, it doesn't just magically go away by shaking it off, and that these people are vulnerable. And there is a moment in the bank robbery scene where Bodhi actually has to use his gun and kill someone. And it's not quite as artistic and visceral as the scene in Butch Cassidy and then Sundance Kid, where Butch kills for the first time when he's on the right side of the law. But there is that feeling in that scene of Bodhi, the gravity of Bodhi realizing he has now gone too far, and the gravity of taking a human life, and then what lines are left to him that he won't cross.
And there's impact, as you talk about the physical fallibility of these characters, there is that sort of psychic fallibility as well. They are making these mistakes and they're having an impact. They're lingering, and it's another thing that makes Bodhi an interesting character within this, potentially schlocky material as well, is that he isn't just, I sort of described him as a psychopath before. He isn't just that. He's someone who realizes he's going too far, as you say. He's committing sins essentially. And he's also aware it's a tactical mistake. So there's that side of it as well. He's going too far pragmatically as well. For his own freedom and safety. So it's very nuanced.
And for the adrenaline rush, they've been smart in all of their bank robberies. They've been very calculated and smart and have not gone for the vault. And at this point, it's not enough for Bodhi. And he needs that added bit. He needs that extra hit in order for the adrenaline rush to touch him.
And it's partly because he's showing off to Johnny. It's partly because he's got a literal captive audience at this point now, and he wants to sort of rub it in Johnny's face and to show off and to transcend what he's already done with Johnny and show him it. And that's another kind of arguably pretty homoerotic side to things as well, but also shows his enamorment with Johnny, and his desire to impress him on a weird way, even where they're now enemies. They're on the wrong side from each other now, but he's still trying to impress him.
It's a fascinating relationship, and it's a fascinating film.
It's a good movie. Thank you for introducing me to it. I really, really enjoyed it, and I'll watch it again, and I was definitely in the mood for it this week. And thank you for talking through those movies with me and those directors. I'm glad we got a bit of Arzner chatting at the beginning as well, because you've as you said, you've chosen the three of the big ones there, but they're great inroads, and for me as a relative novice, it's really great to be able to discuss them with someone as knowledgeable as yourself. Would you like to tell people where they can find you, should they wish to hear more of this great stuff, and what you've been up to recently in terms of recording?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Nannina Gilder, and I'm on Blue Sky and I think Letterboxd as just Nannina, because I think I'm the only one on both of those.
Nice.
And so I mostly post about women directors, and with an emphasis on sort of pre-1970s. And then I also recently recorded on Citizen Dame Pod an episode with Lauren and Karen, two other film critics, about the Japanese director and actress Kinuyo Tanaka, who is sort of a parallel to Ida Lupino in Japan. And she was directing in the 1950s and 60s and is an absolutely fantastic director, and worth checking out her work, and worth checking out that episode where we discuss 3 of her films.
And where you're all fabulous, I should say. Lauren's also been on the show, on the EscapeGoat as well, in an episode with yourself, where we talked about Herzog back in 2022, so I'll link to that as well. And yeah, everyone check out Citizen Dame podcast. They're brilliant, and Nannina's brilliant on it. Thanks for listening, everyone. Say bye-bye for now, Nannina.
Bye.
And bye-bye, everyone. See you soon.
Vaya Con Dios.
Oh, I'm glad you thought. I'm glad that I remembered to mention that in the first half, and I'm glad that you remembered to bring it back there. I will use that as the ending.
This wouldn't be such a big surprise. I take
You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert.